Okay, so I'm just going to make an update video on my Hive monitoring project. Just show you how I use broodminders, multiple broodminders per hive uh, to get the results that I get. I don't follow their convention because I use so many sensors for each hive. I had to come up with my own approach. Luckily, they give you these custom locations, and what I'll do is I'll just run you through how I set up my colonies. So first thing you need to do is log into your mybroodminder.com. For example, I'll just hit this enclosure first, this first one here, just to show you what it looks like. I've got different setups, and these different setups are typically different projects that I run. I like keeping the data separate. One thing you'll notice, for example, this sensor here that's higher than the other ones, that's my sub hub, and I use that to collect most of this data in, I guess, in a very quick way. Just to keep going, so you'll notice, for example, this control colony has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sensors in it. Remember, the last one is just the sub hub. These names, they don't match anything. I have asked Broodminder to see if I could rename these to something more logical, but it might be something coming along. But they do allow me to name my sensors. So you can see here, for example, outside of on the left-hand side, you've got the sensor serial number, and then beside it you have Mount Lorne subhub. If I go to the next one, the serial number, then SC, so that's my single control, slash B2. B is for sensors in the back, M are for sensors in the middle, and F are for sensors at the front. And what I've done is 1, 2, 3. So one position is, for example, F1 would be in the southeast position, and F3 would be in the southwest position. And the center sensor would be F2. So following that logic, M2 is the sensor in the middle of the box. So if we go down, E1 is my sensors at the entrance. Or sorry, at the entrance or bottom port. Over here, so F2, M1, M2, and M3. So for this one, I have 3 in the center, and then 1 in the front center, and 1 in the back center. So if I go to the next one, and basically what that does, it allows me to plot and position the colonies, and then or the sensors, and then I use Excel to manage the data in a more visually effective manner. So for example, here we've got all our sensors, the most up-to-date date of the data capture, and I've got all of them. So if I just click that, it'll bring up the consolidated results for this colony, so the non-slatted rack. So you'll notice that there's 2 sets of bands. These bands on top here, those are the ones closer to the cluster center. And you can see these little bouncy hourly spikes up and down in temperature. That's likely the heater bees throwing the switch on or off for heating. And if I had more granular data, so on a minute by minute, we could see exactly what they're doing on a more micro or granular scale. But right now these are hourly time slots, but you can see that there's quite a bit of difference, I guess 1 or 2 Celsius per hour. But the interesting one here for the non-slatted rack is the middle group here, and you can see how much smoother those lines are. So that tells me that's just outside the cluster, and it's likely some radiation heat coming off the cluster, and it's the cluster's emitting a more constant heat signature. The next set of lines here, these are some sensors below the cluster. Okay, so you can see how There's 3 lines. So the top purple line, I think it's, let's see, it's custom 7. Custom 7, if I go here, so that's the temperature at the entrance, just inside the entrance. Custom 6, this one here, the one right below it, that's the temperature at the center of the bottom board, just below the bottom of the frames. So you can see how there's temperature difference here. And then the lower line, it says outside Hive. Let's see which one that is. I know it's confusing. But let's see, let's just scan on it. Custom 6. And then scale under Hive. So the top one here. So it's the crawl space temperature. So I put a sensor in my Hive base just to get a temperature pretty much in that cavity that I have below all my colonies. So you'll just remember there's difference here. There's a temperature difference here. So that tells me there's air mixture. There's something going on there in the air. So if I just close that up and I'll go to the colony with the slatted rack. Okay, and then just get the data to plot. You'll see it's a very different picture. These 2 bottom lines here, those are the sensors at the top of the bottom board, just inside the entrance, and you can see they're the same. So it just tells me that there's less flow, or there's less mixing, and the air is actually the same temperature. But as you go up, you can see the spread here is much wider than the one with the slatted rack, which tells me that it's a much looser cluster. Okay, so, and it's got the signature spiky line, which tells me that's inside the cluster. And then a few of the other lines are nice and smooth, which tells me those are outside the cluster. Broodminder does collect some outside temperatures via the nearest, I guess, official weather station. So this one here is about 40 kilometers away, and it's actually about 5 to 10 degrees warmer, especially at night, than my location. So I have my own weather station, and in my spreadsheets I use my own information. So in a nutshell, so this is the data. Up here you can pick a time frame. So as I collect more data, I'll likely use the custom range, so I can grab a big data set. And if you're a premium user, you'll see down here it says download CSV file. So that's like an Excel file. So if I click that, it'll download all this temperature data and humidity data onto an Excel file. And then I import that into my calculation spreadsheets. So that's my Broodminder. And that's how I basically manage my data. What I'll do is I'll quickly show you a couple little things just so you can get an idea of how I set things up. First thing off, this is just to show how I build my spreadsheet. So I build myself a nice lookup sheet so I can refer to this sensor description to the actual sensor position. So when I plot it, I know exactly where it is. Okay, so all my spreadsheets and all my sensors have this type of address. So for example, SS is with slatted rack and SL is without and stuff like that. So I've just built my own little code to manage that, and you can see where the sensors are on top of the boxes here. Save, and then last but not least, just a couple of things. Because I'm pulling into Excel, so thanks to Theo at Broodminder, he shared a spreadsheet with me where I've been able to model the temperature between my sensors to get a nicer profile and a visual representation of these lines up here. So it just makes it way easier to look at and see how the cluster is moving. So it's an approximation, it's not exact. I know some of you like extra detail, but I guess for the price and the cost, it gives me the information I need. So you'll notice that this is the colony with a slatted rack. It's the same data we just looked at in Broodminder. And you notice how I I use engineering terms here and there, but I've had a sensor failure here, and what I'll do is I'll just do a forecast of it using some Excel functionality to draw it out. I do have this position recorded for about 7 months last year, so I do have data to show how this sensor just above the slatted rack behaves. I would have loved to have it, but stuff happens, so I just have to move on. But I'll have all the data that I need to make some observations. For example, here back, I think it was 2 o'clock on November 4th, the temperature outside was minus 15, and this was the cluster profile. Okay, and you can see this cut line here, and then modeled looks like this in the profile. Over here, in the morning of, I think it was 8 a.m. on November 8th, the temperature was minus 23, and this is the profile. Okay, so very similar. So I've compared it to last year's profile for a single with a slatted rack, and the profile is almost identical. So it's interesting. And then we had a warm up over here, and pretty much the same. So these blue temperatures, so what I'll do in the next video, I'll explain how I've defined the different colors. So red is more of the center. Gray is likely in the middle of the mantle. And yellow is the possible edge of the cluster based on the temperature. So I'm assuming that anything below 10 degrees Celsius is blue. Okay, and then when you'll notice with some of the ventilation and some of the temperature differences on the next picture that I'm going to show you, you'll notice that the blue also acts like a vent drop. Okay, so it's an open space where there's no bees, and because it's cooler, that's where the density of air increases, and any warm air would cool and start dropping in that section down towards the bottom board. And you can notice that the slatted rack here is running fairly warm, and there's not much blue space for I guess, natural ventilation to occur. So they're comfortable. The heat loss in these walls is slightly higher than the next picture I'm going to show you. And to calculate that, I just take an average temperature, and I know the outside temperature. I know what temperature it is on either side. I know what the material properties are. So I'm able just to do a simple estimated rough cut calculation of what the heat loss is. So I'll just move to the next one, and then you'll see the difference. And again, you've got the temperatures up here and humidity levels down here. And you can see humidity levels for these two bottom lines here are pretty consistent, and they follow each other. So now we've got the single without a slatted rack. Again, you'll notice there's a set of sensors grouped together with the choppiness. So that tells me it's inside the cluster. Then we got some smooth lines here at anywhere from, I don't know, maybe 5 to 9 degrees Celsius. And that tells me those are on the outer edges of the cluster. It's nice and smooth, so it's the outer cluster does emit heat, but in a very constant way. And again, these are fairly loose clusters. So if I here's the temperature profile, and you can see that because I know the location of each of these sensors, that this colony is hanging around. It's more towards the southeast side of the colony. Okay, and then there's a nice blue area on the back here that probably helps with some of the ventilation and the natural convection currents, warm air coming off the cluster, cooling down and then dropping here towards the bottom board and the entrance. And I'm guessing this is why there's a difference in temperature here between these two lines. It's this effect here. So we've got the front sensor underneath the cluster here, and then we've got the lower sensor on the bottom board in the center, and there's a temperature differential there. uh, which is interesting. And you could actually see that at minus 23, cluster's not really changing. And then over here, my guess is the cluster's actually probably expanded downwards because you can see the lower temperatures are higher. So they're hanging lower. And over here, these temperatures, so minus 10 are temperatures just below the cluster. So I have a feeling the cluster has pushed up closer to the top of the colony, so maybe halfway down the frames versus all the way down. So that's one reason I like have a sensor on the bottom board. It gives me an idea of how, I'll say, how deep the cluster is, and it helps me interpret some of these pictures. And again, over here you can see the entrance temperature is higher than the center bottom board, and then the bottom line is that crawl space. So that just gives me an impression of the potential mixing going on in that space. And you can see this blue line here, so that's the closest sensor with a humidity measurement to the cluster. So it's up here, it's the lower one, so it's probably not centered on it. So it's actually the center sensor has a humidity reading on it, and it's around 60%, which is quite all right. 60% at maybe 15 degrees Celsius. And then the other two are these temperatures respectively, so anywhere from -2 to maybe -5. And you can see that these two humidity lines, or H lines, follow each other. They almost parallel each other, which is kind of interesting. So it just tells me it's the same air, but it's been cooled because the moisture content is the same. And the thing to remember about RH, so relative humidity, it's actually based on the actual air temperature. So hopefully this was helpful. I'll keep sharing, and probably the next one I'll explain this chart a bit better and what's going on. So for example here, about 70% of the temperatures are above 70 degrees. So that's one thing I measure. And if I go back to the other one, this one here, about 95% of the temperatures are above 10 degrees. So it just gives me an idea of how tight that cluster is. And basically, yeah, the bees are still really comfortable. And just for my heat loss, this one here is losing about 40% more heat energy to the enclosure than the other colony here. So hope this was helpful. It's a lot of data. The challenge with data is to make a story out of it. And to make a story out of it, you do have to graph it and chart it in a way that makes sense. And having an underlying knowledge of the biology and what goes on in a colony is really important for you to help understand data. Because data is just data if it's not interpreted properly. So I'll leave it there. And great. Thanks for watching.